Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, where we see the question of life. We mentioned that Proverbs gives us a basic approach to life, but then we noted that there are some books which I guess we could call the exceptions, that there are times when you do the right thing and still a negative result takes place. For example, we looked at the book of Job, and in Job we see that the righteous man suffers, and there's times when somebody does right, like Job, and yet for no reason of his own, where he didn't do anything wrong, didn't make the wrong decisions, and yet he goes through great sufferings. Likewise, we're going to see in Ecclesiastes that there's a sense in which we can look at life, and there's sometimes a bit of a lack of meaning to it all. And so we'll see in one of the themes that is going to come up in Ecclesiastes is that under the sun, looked at it from just this perspective, there's a lack of meaning to life. Another of those exceptions that we'll get to eventually, and that's going to be the Song of Solomon, where I think we see a bit of the irrationality of love. But let's dig into Ecclesiastes. Now, we ought to mention that this is part of what's known as the megaloth, that means the scrolls, these 5 scrolls, these 5 shorter books of the Old Testament that were used for special feast days. For example, the Song of Solomon was to be taken out and read at the time of Passover. Ruth was to be read at what they called Shavuot, that is Pentecost, a time when you would be bringing a sort of a grain offering before the Lord, and Ruth takes place in sort of the grain fields, so you can see maybe a little bit of the connection there. Lamentations commemorated the fall of Jerusalem, and so it's appropriate that they would be reading the book of Lamentations at that time. Esther, likewise, we saw that Esther has the corresponding feast of Purim, which commemorates the events that are in the book of Esther. But when we get to Ecclesiastes, we see that was written at a time, it was read at a time, they would take it out and read it at the feast of Sukkot, or as we say, tabernacles. This feast that commemorated the time when Israel was without a land, when the people weren't in the land, and instead of living in homes and in cities and in the land, they lived in tents. And so for that week, they would move out of their houses, and they still do among many Jewish people. They'll build maybe a booth or a tent in the backyard, or maybe they'll all go camping, and for a week they live in tents. And this is the idea where they are remembering a time when Israel did not have a land of its own, when they did not have homes of their own, when they were a nomadic people living in tents. And the book of Ecclesiastes really doesn't talk too much about tents, but it talks about how this entire life is temporary. There's a sense in which we live in tents, and we are living in this between time, this temporary time. And that's going to be one of the big ideas of Ecclesiastes. Now, the book itself is organized into 5 sections. I'm going to describe it as 5 sermons because the writer describes himself as the preacher. And he's going to start that in chapter 1. He starts off in chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then we read what I think is the theme verse, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. We could translate that to say emptiness of emptinesses. And so we have a bit of a prologue in the first 11 verses where he takes us through some of the themes, but then he starts off in chapter 1, verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Jerusalem, and yet I set my mind to seek and to explore by wisdom concerning all that's been done. And so in this first sermon, we're going to see this emptiness idea, this vanity idea, in which we see that all of life is emptiness. But, and there's a big but here, because throughout this first sermon, he, the preacher, he seeks to explore the wisdom of life, and he explores by wisdom in verse 13. You get down to chapter 2, verse 1. He said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. He tries out pleasure. How's that doing? Chapter 12, or 2, verse 12. He says, so I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. And I looked at all of these things, and at the end of the day, it was all a bit empty. But he concludes at the end that man ought to enjoy goodness because it is from God. And so, in doing so, what he's going to do in this first sermon, he introduces what will be the four themes in the next four sermons. So this is really the kickoff sermon. This is the sermon that we could call it the plenary session, although they're all meant to all of us. But he concludes in chapter 2, verse 24. There's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. And this also I have seen, that it's from the hand of God. So God is in the picture. We don't want to think of Ecclesiastes as ignoring God. God is in the picture, but at the same time, there's a certain frailty and an emptiness and a transience to life down here. We come to the second sermon, and the second sermon teaches us that there is profit in seeing God as the giver of all of the seasons of life. In fact, the sermon starts off, chapter 3, verse 1, there's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, and then some of those events are mentioned, a time to give birth, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot what's planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal. And it goes on. It gets to verse 11, and in conclusion, he says, God has made everything appropriate in its time. Notice that he has, but God's the one who's done that. God's referenced in the previous verse. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So we look at life and it's bigger than we are. And there's profit in realizing God has given us all of that. And yet at the same time there is a corresponding monotony of life, where everything goes to the same place. Verse 17, I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous and the wicked man, for a time, for every matter, for every deed that's there. You get down to verse 20, all go to the same place, all came from dust, and all return to dust, and there's even a who knows clause, chapter 3, verse 21. Who knows that the breath, or actually the spirit, is we could translate that, spirit or breath of man ascends upward, and the spirit or breath of the beast descends downward. You look at a man and he dies, and you look at an animal and he dies, and from the outside looking in, you really can't tell the difference. And remember that this is written at a time when the teachings that we have in later on in the Old Testament and in the New Testament about life after death, those hadn't been given yet. And so we have limited revelation at this point. We don't have the whole story. Now there's going to be hints of that at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. A hint that there's this life, and then there's a judgment. There's more to come. But what that comprises had not yet been revealed. Now here's the big ideas here in the second sermon. Life is a gift from God, and to everything there is a season, and this is a call to live purposefully. In other words, because there are certain seasons of life, I have to be aware of that and live accordingly. Also, I think there's a message here that we're called to enjoy the journey. Back when I was a whole lot younger, my wife and I went on this an extended 3-week camping trip, and you have to know my idea of camping is like a Holiday Inn or a Hilton hotel. But we actually had a tent, and we were going to be camping for 3 weeks, and we were camping our way all the way up from South Florida, where we live, all the way up to the mountains of North Carolina, and we spent a whole bunch of weeks there. And we were on the way, and about the third day, my wife said to me, "What is wrong with you? You're uptight, you're sort of irritable," and I said, "Well, we're not there yet." And she said something that rang so true for the time and rings true here in Ecclesiastes. She said to me, "John, enjoy the journey." And I thought about that then. It was a lesson I needed to learn for that couple of weeks, but also a lesson that we all need throughout all of life. Enjoy the journey, not just the goal. And this day and this season is one that God has given. Enjoy it and make the most of it. Part of this enjoyment is found in the one another principles, in that we're called to care for one another and be there for one another. We're going to see that here, but we also see it in the next sermon as well. Now the next sermon is going to tell us, instead of being fearful, enjoy life while it lasts, because this life is a gift from God. And part of that one another section of that life is seen in chapter 4, verse 9, where the writer says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. And if either of them falls, the one will lift up the other. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can they be warm alone? And if one overpowers him who's alone, two can resist. And then if two is good, how much better is three? A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. So enjoy life because it is God's gift. And the one another part of God's life that he's given is a part of that as well. And yet there's a reminder here that there's an emptiness in wisdom. If you're just living to get wise, that's not a good goal in and of itself. Now, it's not saying wisdom's bad, but wisdom for the sake of wisdom can be a bit shallow. The 4th sermon, this is chapter 6 through 9, we see that man sees life as a struggle, but God gave life to be enjoyed. There is a certain struggling in life, and at this point we actually have a series of those 2-line proverbs that we're so familiar with from the book of Proverbs, but we're reminded that there's some hard stuff in this life. And at one point in chapter 7 verse 25, the writer says, I directed my mind to know and to investigate and to seek wisdom and an explanation and to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. And I discovered some bad stuff there. I discovered things that were more bitter, and it wasn't all that good. But then verse 29, he gets there and he gets to his conclusion. Behold, I have found only this, that God made men upright, but they have found out many devices. In other words, there's God gave life to be enjoyed, but there's times when we go astray from that. We also see in this section, actually it's a continuing echo, we see it in other places too, but there's futility in wealth. I can try to get money, and if I'm just trying to get money, that's not a good thing. There's a real emptiness there. In fact, it's in this, we're off the subject of wealth for a second, chapter 9 verse 9, he gives us a wonderful little picture of marriage. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life. Now notice it's a fleeting life. You don't know how long it's going to last, and even if it lasts a long time, it's really not that long. I'm an old guy, so I can say that now. But enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life which he has given you under the sun. For this is your reward in life, and in your toil in which you've labored under the sun. Verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. Take big bites out of life. If you're going to live for God, live for God all the way. And that's a good thing. We get to the last sermon, chapters 10 through 12. And here we see, because of the emptiness of this life, man ought to fear the Lord and follow his word. There's an emptiness to life without that, but if that is included, and that's the fundamental part of my life, then what was empty can have some fullness to it. At the same time, recognize there is a certainty of death, and that's where my last chapter 12, is really taking me. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, we're going to start in verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. Now that's not saying you forget him in your old age, but start remembering him when you're young, before the evil days come and the years draw nigh where you say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. In other words, before all that bad stuff takes place, remember the Lord. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble. Now I want you to see the visual imagery here, and some of us that are on in years can identify with this maybe a bit better, where the watchmen of the house tremble and the mighty men stoop. You ever notice somebody who's older, their posture starts to get a little stooped over, and the grinding ones stand idle because they are few. It's the imagery of a house, but we're describing as the human body. The grinding ones, remember, they didn't have false teeth or bridge work or things like that. That's your teeth. And there aren't so many of them as you get older. And those who look through windows grow dim. Now I'm at this stage in life where I'm having to wear glasses. I actually was at my eye doctor recently, and I said, I think everything's getting a little fuzzier. And he says, well, your glasses are great. They're exactly what they need to be. It's just that you're older, and now you need them all the time. You used to get by just using them for maybe reading or maybe when you're driving, but now you're having to put them on all the time, and you're not used to that. And likewise here, those who look through windows grow dim. Verse 4, and the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. That is, my hearing isn't what it used to be, and yet you'd think if my hearing isn't good, then I'm going to be sleeping soundly through the night. But as you get older, your sleeping habits tend to get a little bit more erratic as well, and things just get tougher. Verse 5, furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. When I was younger, I was a career firefighter. I did, from firefighting to lieutenant to captain to battalion chief, and that was a very active life. And I did some crazy things, running into buildings where the cockroaches were running out of, burning buildings and things like that. And I wouldn't try to do that nowadays. I'm a lot older, and I don't bounce like I used to. And notice terrors on the road and the almond tree blossoms. Notice I put here a picture of an almond tree. When it blossoms, it goes from green to all of a sudden the whole tree turns white. And as we get older, our hair starts to lose whatever color it had before, unless I'm artificially dyeing it or something like that. And all that gray hair, and eventually that gray hair is replaced by white hair, if I've still got hair at all. And the almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags himself along. I don't walk with the same kind of bounce I used to have. And then we read the caperberry is ineffective. I'm going to be a little blunt here. The way we would translate this in early 21st century language is we would say maybe Viagra doesn't work. And by the time this is heard, maybe they're not going to be using that sort of thing. But in other words, the sexual stimuli just isn't there anymore. For man goes to his eternal home while mourners go about in the street. That is, at the end of the day, everyone dies. Remember him, and that was the idea we started off this. In other words, and so this is continuing that same idea. Remember him before the silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed, and the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. In other words, before whatever connects me to life is disconnected. And then when that takes place, verse 7, then the dust will return to the earth as it was. This body is just going to turn to dust. It's going to decay no matter what I do with it. And the spirit will return to God who gave it. Remember God while you can, while you're here. Make this life count. Remember the Lord, because frankly you aren't getting any younger. Every day that passes is a day that cannot be retrieved. Remember the Lord, because God has designed you to be empty without him. At the conclusion of the entire matter, the writer says, vanity of vanities. This is chapter 12, verse 8. Says the preacher, all is vanity, all is empty. And without God, there's a great emptiness there. Now is the time to prepare for eternity. In fact, we get down to the last two verses of this book. The conclusion, when all has been heard, this is verse 13, chapter 12, verse 13. When all has been heard, here it is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. And I would say in every stage of life. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or evil.